What I'm going to tell you is awful. It's one of the most painful and brutal stories I've ever told. And I'm not exaggerating. This is a horrible story. It's about two black boys who suffer an unimaginable end because of a lie. But this is more than just a story about what happened to them. This is a story that shows how injustice against black people was carried out so easily, so effortlessly, that it was like breathing air. It was natural. It's what life was like for black people during a time when the rule of law abandoned us. And this story, it's just one of thousands. Charlie Lang was born around 1928 to Hilliard and Vester Lang in Shubuta, Mississippi, in Clark County. Ernest Green was born around 1927 to Lewis and Mentora Green, also in Shubuta. Charlie Lang and Ernest Green were two boys growing up in Mississippi, born into a world where their fate had already been written for them. But before I tell you what happened to them, you need to understand something about this place, Shubuta, Mississippi. It wasn't just another small southern town. It was a place with a dark reputation. A place known for lynching black people from the very same bridge where these two boys would later die. Years before, in 1918, four black people, Major Clark, his brother Andrew, and two sisters, Maggie and Alma House, were lynched. The two sisters were pregnant. The mob showed them no mercy. That story was so horrific that I covered it in another video where I broke down the history of lynching in Mississippi and how Shubuta became known for mob violence at this lynching bridge. I won't repeat all of that here, but if you haven't seen that video, I highly encourage you to watch it, because what happened to Charlie and Ernest was not an isolated event. This bridge was already stained with blood. So when the two black boys found themselves in danger in Shubuta in 1942, the people in that town didn't wonder what would happen next. They already knew, because they had seen it and done it before. In 1942, Charlie Lang was 14 and Ernest Green was 15. When they weren't working, Ernest and Charlie spent their time looking for scrap metal and old tires. With the country at war, metal and rubber were in high demand, and the boys knew they could sell what they found to help support themselves. It wasn't much, but it was something. During one of their hunts, the town's marshal arrested them for stealing a tire from an old junk pile. But because they were minors, instead of sending them to jail, he released them to their white employers. Ernest worked for a white man named Floyd Hudson, who owned the local drugstore, and Charlie worked at the town barbershop, shining shoes for customers. Despite being in their teens, neither Charlie nor Ernest made it past the second grade. Shubuta schools for black children were underfunded and overcrowded. 160 black students were crammed into a 6-room schoolhouse, and only 2 of those teachers even had a college degree. Mississippi did not care about educating black children. In some parts of the state, white schools received up to 40 times more funding than black schools did. Charlie and Ernest grew up in a world that set them up to fail. They lived in the black section of town, known as the Bottoms. Ernest lived with his mother and his sister. Charlie's mother had moved to Hattiesburg, and his father worked on the railroad, keeping him away from home most of the time. That left Charlie to fend for himself. But whenever he ventured out, he did it with his best friend Ernest. The two were inseparable. On October 6, 1942, it was supposed to be just another day. The boys made their way to the highway bridge south of Shubuta, looking for metal and tires like they always did. They started scavenging, not knowing this would be their last time. As Charlie and Ernest searched, 15-year-old Dorothy Martin was walking home from school. She lived near the bridge. As she walked, she saw Charlie come from under it. It's possible that he may have startled her. But Dorothy knew Charlie. He had done odd jobs for her father. She kept walking. The boys kept scavenging. It was an uneventful moment, and Charlie and Ernest didn't think any more about it. When they finished scavenging, they went on with their day. Charlie made his way back into town, where he met up with a man named Ed Manning. He was a black pulpwood hauler. Charlie sometimes helped him with work for extra money. Meanwhile, Ernest went home and had dinner with his family, and later went to see a movie with a friend. The boys hadn't given Dorothy Martin another thought since they saw her earlier that day. But for some reason, Dorothy was still thinking about them. The Martin family had only been in Shubuta for a few months. Dorothy's father, Dan Martin, moved his family there after getting a job at Jim Oden's sawmill. Unlike the town's wealthy and established white families, the Martins were a part of a growing group of working-class white migrants who arrived there looking for jobs in lumber and in the textile mills. But Dan Martin and his brothers weren't respectable men. They had a reputation for being rough, and townspeople whispered about their drinking and violent temper. Dorothy arrived home around 4 p.m., and instead of doing her homework and getting ready for dinner, she decided to lie on Ernest and Charlie. She told a story that was known to end badly for black men and black boys. She told her mother that a boy chased her across the bridge. Her mother did not hesitate. She rushed across the road to Jim Oden's convenience store and told him what Dorothy said. Oden wasn't just a store owner. He also ran the sawmill where Dorothy's father worked, and he was a man known for his drinking and temper. After hearing Dorothy's story, he did not stop to ask a question. He did not try to verify what happened. He left immediately to find the town marshal, Ed McLendon. Oden found McLendon in the mayor's office. When he told him that a black boy had chased a white girl, McLendon didn't ask for details. He didn't investigate. He didn't even consider the possibility that Dorothy might have lied. He simply got up and went to find him, taking another man with him, Paul Stewart, who was his driver. Together, they went straight to look for Charlie Lang. Meanwhile, Dorothy's father, Dan Martin, had arrived home and was met by Jim Oden. He told Dan what happened. Dan, who was normally drunk, quickly sobered up and went into a rage. Oden and Dan hurried to meet McLendon, who was now waiting at the lumber yard. He suspected that Charlie was with Ed Manning, since Charlie sometimes helped him for extra work. But when Manning's truck did not show up, they went looking for him. They found Ed Manning's truck broken down on the side of the road. Sitting in the back was Charlie Lang. The men didn't explain why they were there. They didn't ask questions. They seized Charlie immediately. He had no idea what was happening or why. No one told him what he was being accused of. No one gave him a chance to defend himself. They threw him in the back of their car and drove him straight to Odom's store. When they arrived, they called for Dorothy. They wanted her to identify Charlie as the boy who had chased her. Dorothy arrived and looked at Charlie, and then she spoke. She said he was the one who tried to violate her and then chased her across the bridge. That one sentence sealed his fate. A few words from a 15-year-old white girl was enough to put Charlie Lang's life in immediate danger. With that statement, Dorothy set in motion a chain of events that will lead to pain, trauma, brutality, and injustice. It would change the course of two families forever. After Dorothy identified Charlie, Marshal McLendon took him back to the bridge, where he claimed that Charlie confessed. According to McLendon, Charlie admitted that he not only tried to attack Dorothy, but that he followed her from town, waited under the bridge, and then he jumped out at her. McLendon also claimed that Charlie said that Dorothy was scared, but that he told Dorothy that there was no need to run because he was going to do something really bad to her. But that wasn't all. McLendon claimed that Charlie said something else, that he wasn't the only one they wanted, that it was Ernest. Even though Dorothy had never mentioned Ernest, McLendon took Charlie's supposed statement as fact, and they went to get Ernest. Everything McLendon claimed was a lie. None of it was true. Charlie never followed Dorothy. He never hid under the bridge. He never threatened her. But that did not matter. The lie had already done its job. This wasn't about the truth. It was about justifying what was to come. Justifying the terror, the brutality, the injustice. And for Charlie, we can only imagine how terrified he must have been. He was just a child, not a grown man. He wasn't thinking about hurting anyone. All he wanted to do was scavenge for metal like he had done so many times before. But now, he was trapped in a contest against Jim Crow, a contest he had no chance of winning. McLendon and his men arrived at Ernest Green's home. His mother, Mentora Green, answered the door. She had no idea that she was about to lose her son. McLendon told her that they wanted to talk to Ernest, that they would have him back shortly. They lied. And that was the last time that Mentora Green ever saw her son. Some people will hear this and think about what they would have done, that they would have never let them take their child, that they would have gone down fighting. Some might even feel anger toward Mentora Green, wondering why she didn't resist. But that is not fair to her or the reality of the time. This was 1942 in Jim Crow, Mississippi, a world where black people had no rights, no legal protection, and no one to turn to for help. If Mentora had fought back, those men would have overpowered her without hesitation, and they still would have taken Ernest. No one would have stopped them. No one would have come to the rescue. No one would have been punished. This was the reality of being black in America at that time. When the law didn't protect you, it hunted you. When white people could do whatever they wanted to you, with no consequences. To be black was to live in a world where simply existing in the wrong place at the wrong time could mean danger. We have to be careful not to judge history through the lens of today. It's easy to say what we think we would have done. But the truth is, none of us can fathom what it was like to be black in Jim Crow, Mississippi. Mentora was faced with an impossible situation, one that none of us would ever want to be in. What happened next is not exactly clear. The lies told by those involved in this injustice all pointed to one conclusion: that Charlie and Ernest had tried to violate Dorothy. Everything else was fabricated and strung together to justify the ultimate unjust goal. Even though Dorothy denied ever seeing Ernest, officials later claimed that the boys turned on each other. A highway patrolman who arrived while the boys were being interrogated claimed that he heard the boys admit to not only planning to attack Dorothy, but also saying that they had plans to attack Jim Oden's daughter. With the so-called confessions they wanted, Marshal McLendon had Charlie and Ernest arrested and taken to the county jail in Quitman. The next day, McLendon claimed that he returned to the jail and that Ernest made yet another confession. According to McLendon, Ernest allegedly said that their plan was for Charlie to drag Dorothy under the bridge. None of this made sense. Dorothy never even mentioned Ernest. But suddenly, officials claimed that Charlie and Ernest had turned on one another. And somehow, in the span of just a few hours, their so-called confessions escalated from a single accusation to a wild conspiracy theory where not only did they allegedly plan to attack Dorothy, but also Jim Oden's daughter. It didn't matter that none of this made any sense. It didn't matter that Dorothy's own story never involved Ernest. It didn't matter that the supposed confessions didn't match up. The truth didn't matter, because the goal wasn't to find the truth. It was to justify their ultimate goal, to find a story to fit the punishment that they had already decided on. At the same time that officials were claiming that the boys had confessed, others in town were telling a very different story. On the black side of town, people believed that nothing more than a childish prank had happened. Some said that Dorothy had been startled by a frog that the boys caught, and that was all that there was to it. Others said that Dorothy had actually spoken to the boys first. And then there was the white passenger who drove by at the very moment that Dorothy claimed that she had been chased. He later said that he saw Dorothy talking to one of the boys and that the interaction seemed odd to him. He wasn't from Shubuta, and in his mind, a white girl talking to a black boy was unusual because he wasn't used to seeing people be there friendly with black people. Then there were the rumors. Whispers that Dorothy had made the entire story up and told her father, but that her father gave her a whipping because he couldn't risk being embarrassed and the family being humiliated. After Charlie and Ernest were arrested and thrown in jail, their families weren't allowed to see them. Officials told them that if they wanted to see their sons, they would have to pay to get them out. Their bonds were set at $1,000 each, a sum their families could never afford. And so, Charlie and Ernest sat in the jail cell alone. No parents, no loved ones, no attorney. No one coming to see them. Let's step back for a moment. Think about everything we just learned and what we went through. The contradictions, the changing stories, the fact that Dorothy never even mentioned Ernest, the way the accusations escalated out of nowhere, from a single claim to a wild story about multiple planned attacks. It didn't matter that none of it made sense. It didn't matter that the so-called confessions didn't match up. It didn't matter that there were more questions than answers, because truth wasn't what mattered. Race is what mattered. This was 1942 in Jim Crow, Mississippi. The boys were black and Dorothy was white, and that was all there was to it. Once the injustice train started moving, there was no stopping it. If you were black and accused, it was over. You were guilty. No evidence was needed. No investigation was necessary. And once that lie was told, it didn't just stick, it became fact. For Charlie and Ernest, there was no way out. And as they sat in the jail cell waiting for what was to come, the town around them was already making its decision. When Charlie Lang and Ernest Green arrived at the Clark County Jail on October 6, 1942, They weren't alone. A black man named Isaiah Shine was already in custody. Shine had been wandering through Mississippi after being discharged from the Army. He was struggling with his mental health, and he was picked up by authorities in Hattiesburg. He was waiting to be transferred back to the state mental hospital when the boys were thrown into his cell. Shine later recalled hearing something that struck him as unusual: the sound of children sobbing. Moments later, Charlie and Ernest were tossed into his cell. They were scared and trembling and confused, with no idea of what was going on. For days, they sat there with Shine in their jail cell, trapped in the dark, denied any contact with their families, denied even a chance to plead for their lives. And then, on October 10th, 1942, the mob came for them. Isaiah Shine watched as the men stormed into the jail. Terrified, he begged them to take him instead. He shouted, "Don't take them. I'm the one who wants to go. I want to get out." But the mob ignored him. Instead, they beat him and threw him aside, leaving him to watch as they grabbed Ernest and Charlie. The boys screamed and kicked, and they cried as they were dragged from the cell, dragged down the stairs, and dragged outside to a waiting caravan of cars. What happened next, we can only imagine. We can only imagine the terror that gripped Charlie and Ernest as they sat in that car, surrounded by men who only had one goal in mind, and that was to end their lives. We can only imagine their fear as they rode in silence, the weight of their fate settling in, knowing what was about to come. They were taken to the bridge, the same bridge where just 24 years earlier, 4 black people had been lynched. The same bridge where the blood of the past had already stained the waters below. Nooses were placed around their necks, and then they were thrown over the edge. One hung from one side of the bridge, the other from the opposite side. 2 children, 2 little boys, lost their lives in a tragic and horrific way. Jim Crow made no distinction for them. Their age did not matter. The men who did this, grown men, did not care. They did not hesitate. They did not think twice about what they were doing. They had already decided that these 2 boys were guilty. And so, for the crime of chasing a white girl, Ernest Green and Charlie Lang were lynched. Can you imagine what those boys felt in that moment? Stepping out of that car, looking up at the bridge, seeing the ropes. They had to have known what was about to happen, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. No one was coming to save them. This is hard to hear, and it's hard to talk about, but it has to be talked about, because this happened. It happened to these real black boys, and it happened to thousands of others. I don't want you to just hear this and move on. I want you to really sit with this moment. Think about what this means. Think about what it meant for black people back then, to live with this kind of fear, to know that something like this could happen at any moment. Think about how we have carried this trauma and this pain down through the generations. And then think about what it means for us today. What happens next in this story only adds to this injustice. The morning after the lynching, news of the brutal act reached FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. The extreme youth of the victims shocked officials. Hoover immediately sent agents to Shubuta and ordered an investigation and a report to be put on his desk within 2 weeks. But it wasn't just the FBI. Mississippi Governor Paul Johnson, he did something unusual. He didn't just express regret as governors had done before. He ordered an investigation and called for the mob members to be brought to justice. This was a sharp contrast to what happened 24 years earlier. Back in 1918, when the Clark brothers and the House sisters were lynched from that very same bridge, Mississippi's governor at the time, Theodore Bilbo, he had a much different response. When the NAACP demanded an investigation, Bilbo told them to go to hell. So why the sudden shift? Why did officials act like they wanted justice this time? The answer was simple: public perception. The fact that the victims were so young made this case harder to ignore. This wasn't a grown black man accused of a crime. These were children. The federal government wanted to avoid criticism, and Governor Johnson didn't want Mississippi to look like a lawless state. But as FBI agents arrived in Shubuta, they weren't met with truth. They were met with a web of lies. The FBI agents from the Jackson field office headed straight for Quitman, where the boys had been held before being lynched. Their first stop was to Town Marshal Fortner Dabbs. Dabbs had some explaining to do. How did the mob manage to storm his jail and take 2 boys and he not do anything to stop it? According to him, he was the victim of a well-executed ruse. He told the FBI that on the night of the lynching, he received a call from a man claiming to be a constable. The man said that he had a prisoner that needed to be booked into the jail. Dabbs said that when he arrived at the jail, he was ambushed and a shadowy figure threw a blanket over him. He was pinned down and they took his keys. He was then thrown into the cell next to where Ernest and Charlie were. Dabbs had an answer for everything. When the FBI asked him how it was possible that he didn't see anything, how he only saw shadowy figures instead of recognizing anyone, Dabbs had a convenient excuse. He claimed that a faulty light socket prevented him from seeing anyone's faces. This is how he got out of naming anyone to make sure that the plan could remain a secret. But he wasn't just somebody who was a victim of a well-executed ruse. He was part of the plan. Fortner Dabbs liked to present himself as a lawman, but in reality, he was a farmer and a cattleman, and a man who had no problem getting his hands dirty. Back in 1931, a white man named Ozzie Wilkerson lost his life to a black man named George McInnes. George had been renting land from Dabbs, and so had Ozzie. At trial, a shocking detail emerged. Dabbs had taken out an insurance policy on Ozzie Wilkerson, and he told George that if he took Ozzie's life, he would pay him. Instead of receiving the death penalty or being lynched, George McInnes was given life in prison. As for Dabbs, he was charged and he was prosecuted. But the newly elected judge, who was a friend of Dabbs, dismissed the case after George McInnes recanted his confession. Dabbs walked away a free man, and less than a decade later, George McInnes was quietly released from prison. Fortner Dabbs was no stranger to corruption or brutality. He had gotten away with it before, and now he was prepared to get away with it once again. No one had to lift a hand or swing a rope to be responsible for this lynching. All they had to do was nothing, and they played their parts very well. The moment Ernest and Charlie were seized, screams rang out through the jail. Isaiah Shine begged for someone to help them, and Dabbs also screamed out. The town had a night watchman who was supposed to patrol the courthouse and the jail grounds, but he wasn't patrolling at all because he doubled as a night clerk at the Quitman Hotel. At the time that Shine and Dabbs were screaming for help, the watchman was inside the hotel, drinking with the oil man. He wasn't watching the jail. He wasn't patrolling the courthouse. And when the screams finally reached him, it was already too late. By the time the watchman freed Dabbs, the boys were gone. Instead of launching a search to save them, Dabbs called the sheriff's office and the county attorney. They knew that 2 children had been kidnapped. They knew what that meant, and yet they decided to wait until morning. When daylight finally came, Dabbs and Sheriff Lloyd McNeil began their so-called investigation, but there was no urgency. They knew that 2 boys had been kidnapped from the jail in the middle of the night. They knew exactly what that meant, but instead of moving with urgency, they moved at a snail's pace. Their first stop was the town marshal Ed McClendon's home. When they arrived, McClendon was asleep. Neither his wife nor Dabbs wanted to wake him, so they left. They said McClendon needed rest. After all, he had had a very long night at the bridge just a few hours earlier. After that, they stopped at the drugstore where Ernest worked. His boss hadn't seen him, and that was it. Dabbs and McNeil looked at each other, no leads, no urgency, no problem. Dabbs decided that he had farm work to do, and Sheriff McNeil said that he needed to eat breakfast. That was the end of their investigation. The lynching at the bridge was not a secret. White residents knew what had happened, but many acted as if they had no clue. To keep up the lie that no one knew anything, they waited for a black laborer to cross the bridge to be the first one to discover the boys' bodies. Once the news spread, Town Marshal Ed McClendon could stop pretending. He rode out to the bridge. When he arrived, the bodies of Ernest and Charlie were still swinging and hanging from the bridge. A large crowd had already gathered, with men and women and children. They had come to see the latest victims of Jim Crow's justice at the lynching bridge. There was no urgency, no shock, no outrage, just curiosity. Soon, the justice of the peace called for a coroner's jury, but there was no investigation, no questioning, no search for the truth. The coroner quickly wrote down the official ruling, hanged by parties unknown. And with that, it was over. The mob had accomplished what it wanted. Ernest and Charlie had received the Jim Crow death sentence because of a lie. 2 children had lost their lives because they were accused of chasing a white girl across a bridge. Once the coroner's jury signed off on the cover-up, the boys' bodies were cut down. They weren't treated with dignity. Instead, they were loaded into the back of a Chevy lumber truck like discarded waste. Dan Martin, who was Dorothy's father, he stood there watching. He screamed to the men handling the bodies that they better hurry up, otherwise he would come over and cut their heads off himself. But the cruelty did not end there. As the truck pulled into town, McClendon and Sheriff McNeil set out to find the boys' parents. Around the same time, Charlie's father, Hilliard Lang, was in downtown Shubuta, desperately trying to find someone who could post a bond for his son. He didn't yet know what had happened, and then the truck pulled up beside him. In the back of the truck, uncovered, lay 2 small bodies, nooses still around their necks. One of them was his son. Hilliard looked at Charlie. He saw what they had done to him. He must have been filled with rage, filled with pain, and filled with the desire for revenge. But there was nothing he could do. This was Jim Crow, Mississippi. Black people had no rights, no protection. They were treated as if they weren't even human. So Hilliard Lang did what so many black parents before him had done, what they had been forced to do. He did nothing. He turned around and walked back home. Hours earlier, Charlie sat in that jail cell, waiting. Maybe he thought about his father. Maybe he believed that somehow his dad would come and get him. But that moment never came. And now, here was his father seeing his son in the back of a truck, standing on the street, looking at the brutal reality of what had been done to his baby boy. This wasn't just an announcement of death. This was a physical representation of injustice. Here was his boy, the child that he had raised, the son that he had loved, the one he had watched grow. And now Charlie lay in the back of a truck like a piece of discarded trash. A noose still around his neck, his small body battered and lifeless. Hilliard didn't have to guess what happened, because he knew. He knew his son had died in fear. He knew Charlie had been terrorized in his final moments. And he knew that there was nothing he could have done to stop it. We don't know exactly what Hilliard was thinking in that moment, but whatever it was crushing. It was the kind of pain that never leaves you, the kind of loss that haunts you for the rest of your days. This was Black life, painful, unforgiving, and cruel. And this is why these stories must be told, because this was the reality of being Black in America during this time period. And as if this pain wasn't enough, what happened next was meant to make sure that everyone knew who was in control. McClendon tried to get Hilliard to take his son's body, but Hilliard refused. He kept walking. Ernest's mother, Mentora Green, also refused. She didn't want to see her son like that. So the boys' bodies were taken to Will Patton's funeral home. But before they arrived, the truck carrying them was driven all over town. It wasn't just a body transport. It was a statement. It was a display of power, a final act of psychological terror. The truck wasn't rushed. It wasn't hidden. It passed through the streets of Shubuta, a victory lap for terror against Black people. And then, in one last act of cruelty, the truck made a stop. It was driven to the white school so that the children could come and see the boys' bodies. After all of the lawlessness and violence and brutality, the men who lynched Ernest Green and Charlie Lang suddenly wanted to act like there were rules to follow. They had stormed the jail without hesitation, dragged 2 children from their cells, beat them and terrorized them, and hanged them from a bridge. And now they wanted to return the bodies to their families, as if this was just a part of the process. Claim the bodies, they told them, because that's what had to be done. Bury your sons, they said, because they deserve a proper burial. Where was all this process, order, and decency when they stormed the jail? When they drove the boys to the bridge? When they strung them up and left them hanging there? This was the ridiculousness of Jim Crow. They lynched these boys for no reason, then tried to wash their hands of it, as if they had not done anything wrong, as if this was some kind of peace offering, as if that somehow this made it right. But the Green and Lang families lost everything, not just their sons, but their dignity, and their peace, and their sense of security. The mob just didn't steal their children. They stole everything from them. The boys were taken to Patton's funeral home. But Will Patton wasn't just a funeral director. 24 years earlier, he was one of the mob leaders in the Clark brother and House sisters lynching. And now, here he was again, playing his role. Patton had a crew of black men dig 2 graves outside the white cemetery fence. Just like he had done before, the boys were put in 2 cheap pine boxes, with their hands still tied behind their backs. They were put in the ground. They arrived at the funeral home at 9 a.m., and by 12 noon, they were in the ground. No dignity, no ceremony. The injustice had been completed. Everyone in town had a story for the FBI, and they all told the same lie. Town Marshal Ed McClendon claimed that he was on duty the night of the lynching, and at around 10 p.m., he said he left with his driver to take a random ride to Waynesboro for no reason at all. Then he said he went home and listened to the radio all night until he went to bed around 4 a.m. His driver told the same story. Late-night bus passengers provided convenient alibis for mob members, claiming that they were with them at the time of the lynching. Others in town simply pretended to know nothing at all. The investigation was going nowhere. Everyone was covering for one another. And as they lied to the FBI, white residents also worked behind the scenes to discredit and to demean Ernest and Charlie. They called Ernest and Charlie delinquents. They spread rumors that the boys were sorry Negroes and troublemakers and thieves and liars. Dan Martin and Jim Odom even claimed that the boys had tried to violate a 9-year-old black girl in their neighborhood. It was another lie. The story meant to convince outsiders that these boys deserved what happened to them, that there was no need to investigate, that justice had already been served on them. But black residents refused to let that lie stand. They spoke up. They said Ernest and Charlie weren't troublemakers. They were quiet, good boys. As for the allegation about the young black girl, the girl's grandmother spoke up. Missy Hales told the truth. She said that Charlie had come into her house, but not to attack her granddaughter, but to steal food, because he was hungry, because he was poor, and because he was a child trying to survive. Everyone knew who did it, but no one dared to say it out loud. FBI agents tried to get Hilary Lang to name names. He refused. He couldn't risk the mob coming back for him or his family. But in Quitman, an old white man quietly pulled an FBI agent aside. He had gone to see the boys' bodies at the time that they were discovered. And when he was there, he said that he heard people talking. He named names. He said it was Dan Martin, his brother-in-law, and 2 sons-in-law, and Marshal Ed McClendon, that they were the ones who carried out the brutal lynching. But when the FBI agent went back to talk to the man, his wife said that he was missing, that he suddenly just disappeared, and she hadn't seen him. Governor Paul B. Johnson publicly criticized Sheriff McNeil for failing to stop the lynching, but no one cared. 5 days after the Shubuta lynching, Mississippi saw another one. This time, it happened in Jones County. A black man named Howard Wash was seized from the jail and hung from a bridge. He had been convicted of taking the life of his white boss, but the facts told another story. It was self-defense, and because of that, the jury refused to sentence him to death. By law, the judge couldn't give him the death penalty, but a mob didn't have that problem. They came for Howard, and they carried out the sentence they wanted: death by hanging. 3 lynchings in a single week. Mississippi was looking like a lawless place in the news and press all over the country. The FBI knew who was responsible, but knowing wasn't enough. Everyone in town was sticking to their story. No one would talk. No one would break. They needed proof, and while they did have some inconsistencies, that wasn't enough. Marshal Dabbs claimed that someone called him that night. That was a lie. The telephone company confirmed with the FBI that no one called him. But again, this wasn't enough to secure a conviction in Mississippi. Their investigation had turned up no real leads that will lead them to bring a prosecution for the lynching of these 2 boys. There was one man who saw everything: Isaiah Shine. He was in the jail that night that the boys were taken. He had begged the mob to take him instead. His story was spreading all through town, and this was bad for the men responsible for the lynching, so they quickly handled it. Shine was immediately sent to the state mental hospital. But the resistance to justice in this case wasn't just about protecting a few men. It was about protecting an entire system. The lynching of Charlie Lang and Ernest Green wasn't random. It happened in October of 1942, the same time the U.S. Congress was debating an anti-poll tax bill. At the time, a major political battle was unfolding in Washington over poll taxes. This was a fee imposed by southern states to keep black people and poor whites from voting. Civil rights activists had been fighting to get rid of it for years, and by 1942, Congress had finally passed a bill to abolish it. But Southern politicians, led by Mississippi Senator Theodore Bilbo, fought hard to block it. Bilbo was known for his extreme views on race, and he threatened to filibuster the bill by vowing to talk for hours to stop its passage in the Senate. But this wasn't just about elections. It was about fear. White leaders were worried that if black people gained political power, they could challenge the entire racial and social order in the South. Many white Mississippians weren't just resisting the government's push to eliminate the poll tax. They were resisting any change that could disrupt their dominance. And black newspapers called it out for what it was. Some said this lynching wasn't just about the accusation against Green and Lang. It was a warning to black people who were pushing for their rights. The same people who were fighting to keep black citizens from voting were the same ones making sure no one was punished for this crime. In Mississippi, the fight against the poll tax and the fight to cover up this lynching were not separate battles. They were one and the same, a desperate attempt to hold on to power at any cost. The lynching of Ernest Green and Charlie Lang in 1942 sent shockwaves through black communities nationwide. The gruesome photo of their bodies, taken by a white tire dealer and circulated in black newspapers, ignited outrage. In New Orleans, the NAACP used the image on recruitment flyers, urging black citizens to organize and fight back against racial violence. Black leaders and activists responded swiftly. In Harlem, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and other civil rights figures called for mass protests, demanding accountability. Across the country, black newspapers condemned the slayings, calling them yet another tragic example of brutality against black people. One of the most powerful voices of the Harlem Renaissance era was poet Langston Hughes. By the 1940s, he had written more than 30 poems about lynching, and when he learned about Charlie and Ernest, he wrote another one, a powerful poem called The Bitter River. The Bitter River was his response to what had happened in Mississippi. But he wasn't just mourning these two boys. He was indicting the entire system that made their deaths possible. The Bitter River in the poem is more than just water. It's a symbol of everything that black people have been forced to endure, from slavery to segregation. It's a river that has poisoned dreams and stolen futures and drowned justice. Before I continue, I want to read you just a little bit of the poem. Listen to these words. I did not ask for this river, nor the taste of its bitter brew. I was given its water as a gift from you. Yours has been the power to force my back to the wall and to make me drink from the bitter cup mixed with blood and gall. That line, I did not ask for this river, it speaks to the reality of black life in America. Black people never asked for slavery, never asked for convict leasing, lynchings, Jim Crow, or segregation. We never asked for systemic equality, never asked to be hung from trees and burned alive in front of thousands of cheering people. We never asked to be kept on plantations and made to work in slave-like conditions, even after emancipation. We never asked to be terrorized in our own homes and dragged from our beds and have our lives taken in the middle of the night. We never asked to have our towns burned to the ground because we built success on our own. We never asked to be locked into neighborhoods with no jobs and no opportunities and no resources. We never asked to have our children placed in underfunded schools while being told to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. We never asked to fight in America's wars, only to come home and be treated as less than human. We never asked to be forced into prisons and chain gangs, working without pay like slavery. Everything that we have suffered was something that was done to us. These systems of oppression did not exist before they were placed on black people. And through his poetry, Hughes was trying to show the world what black people were experiencing in America. But there's something else you need to see. There's a photo of what happened that day. I can't show it here for obvious reasons, but you really should see it, because when people hear the word lynching, they might picture grown men, but that's not what this was. This picture shows two little boys, two children, with nooses still around their necks, thrown in the back of a truck, tossed around like they were trash, like their lives meant nothing. Seeing it makes the truth undeniable. I've included the image on my blog. What happened to Charlie Lang and Ernest Green happened thousands of times. I've said before, the injustices that black people have endured could fill every book and 1,000 libraries. And to be honest, there'll still be more books to write and more libraries to build. That's how much we've suffered. And that's why these stories matter and why it's important that they're told. This is not just a sad true crime story. This is real life. This is what it meant to be black. Black equaled injustice. Injustice from the moment you were born until the moment you took your last breath. I want to know your thoughts on this story. Had you ever heard of these two boys, and how did it make you feel learning all that they went through? Leave me a comment down below and let me know your thoughts.